You are listening to Data Decoded, a podcast from the Data Justice Hub at Concordia University.
We are a collaborative project aiming to understand how activists gather and make sense of data.
Want to learn how activists are using data to fight evictions and how to use data to push universities to stop investing in fossil fuels?
In this new series, we find out what drives activists and how they use data to further their cause. We find out how data activists work to make the world a fairer place.
To listen to their stories and more, tune in to Data Decoded, wherever you get your podcasts. For this episode, we are speaking with Dr. Erin McElroy. They are an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of Texas and the co-founder of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. The Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is described as a counter-mapping and digital storytelling collective that documents the dispossession and resistance struggles upon gentrifying landscapes, and Erin is at the head of this work.
So for us, we started making maps because gentrification and evictions are such spatial phenomena, and we wanted to better understand which neighborhoods are being hit the hardest, or if we wanted to understand any sort of correlation, spatial correlation between Google bus stops and evictions. And that was very spatial in nature, so maps made sense.
The Anti-Eviction Mapping Project boasts an impressive community, with working collectives in the San Francisco Bay Area, New York City, and Los Angeles. An international leg, the Park X Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, is based in Montreal. Their work in both the United States and Canada aims to humanize and protect tenants by sharing their stories of grief, triumph, and community through digital mapping, guidebooks, zines, and outreach.
So yeah, this woman, her name was Mary Elizabeth Phillips. She went by Emmy. She had been living in this home for decades. And she was at 97, she was living alone, but had a really close relationship to her neighbor who also lived in the building, Sarah, who was effectively her main caregiver. And so Sarah was coming to our meetings on their behalf because Emmy couldn't make it to our nighttime meetings. And so, yeah, we started to do research with Sarah to better understand what was going on and who 55 Dolores Street LLC might be. And like I said, we started to notice other buildings that were kind of owned by the same investment company, Urban Green, across the city. And, there are lots of different housing organizations doing amazing work in San Francisco. It's a city that has a long history of tenant organizing. So we started working with other groups too that were, representing some of those tenants in their eviction fights. So there, were groups like the Tenderloin Housing Clinic, and they provided some legal counsel to support some of the tenants who were being evicted, and groups like the Housing Rights Committee. So at any rate, we started doing a lot of coalition work and organizing these campaigns against Urban Green. And we would show up to their offices, which were in a much wealthier, whiter part of town, and do these demonstrations. And we would, we started to produce a lot of media about them. So the mapping project also began making these static web pages, which are actually some of when we look at our website and which pages are most popular, these are still oftentimes the most popular ones, but we'll make basically these static web pages about particular evictors where we list out all of their LLCs and histories and properties, and sometimes a bit about them to make it better understood that they're actually humans profiting off of other people's evictions and dispossession, and kind of debunk the idea that it's just all of these obtuse sounding investment companies. So anyway, we started doing a lot of that sort of organizing. And it was a sort of bittersweet when at the end we got them to agree not to evict Emmy and to allow her to live out the rest of her life in that building. But we couldn't get the same protections for her neighbors. So even though she was allowed to stay in the building, Sarah and others were forced to leave. Mary made it to the age of 100 and then she passed away, but I mean, which is an amazing long life. But unfortunately, like after she passed away, the entire building got flipped. And so all the units, 6 units in that building were sold as kind of high-end condos. And now there's a Whole Foods grocery store across the street. And it's, just sort of the classic tale of gentrification. But so that's, they're a partial win, but just to say there were other wins that were more victorious. So a friend of mine, Benito Santiago, was also being evicted around this time by Pineapple Boy LLC. And again, we wrote who was that and figured out that it was this man named Michael Harrison. He worked and was co-founder of this big real estate company and similarly started doing all these demonstrations at the real estate company's offices. And those were successful enough that Michael Harrison dropped the eviction and we were able to get the San Francisco Community Land Trust involved to purchase the building so that it wouldn't go through the same thing again. Like we didn't want to keep Benito and his co-tenants from being evicted and then have another real estate speculator come on the scene and try the same thing all over again. So we were able to work with the land trust to buy the building and then offer the tenants their 99-year leases. So Benito's still there. And that often for us is a very kind of ultimate sort of win on a building by building level when we can help tenants stay in their homes, but also keep those homes off the market. And it's, it's direct action, it's coalition work, but there also is, of course, like research involved in it. There was, I think one of the most beautiful parts about organizing actually are the relationships you build. And so, in the middle of a city where people are being pushed out and there's so much loss and trauma, there's also new communities that are formed through organizing. So I think a lot of the tenants who I supported and, we collectively supported and their, eviction struggles are still people who I'm in touch with and people who are friends with each other. And, so there's that sort of tight-knit solidarity that gets formed through organizing. And there's all, I think another thing in kind of doing that work is there are, channels to express sort of collective rage towards what's happening. And it's not just this, like, people don't feel as isolated in their sadness and frustration and anger around the changes taking place. So that's something that I think was gained through organizing. It's also something though that we continue to develop in the mapping project through oral history work and narrative-based work that we continue, that I'm still a part of, and we've done a lot of that during the pandemic. Because so often when people are being evicted, maybe there will be a media story or two, like a journalist might come and do a little story, but they just want the sort of clickbait, salient quotes, because that's more, the nature of their field and the point of writing the articles that they write. But sometimes like the longer, more nuanced histories of space and place and get lost. And I think that what's nice about oral history is a relationship can often be formed between the storyteller and the person helping produce the oral history. And so that's one of the reasons why in the mapping project, in addition to producing maps and tools, we do a lot of this narrative-based work to kind of reground in relationships and to kind of think through the more nuanced stories of place that get lost as areas gentrify and people get pushed out. But we do, so in terms of the kind of identifying corporate landlords and supporting tenants in that, we for the last since 2019, we've been building this tool that now is working in San Francisco, and we're working on an Oakland version. And it's a tool where you can look up an address or look up a shell company and automatically see all of the other properties associated with it and all of the shell companies associated with it and all of the evictions. In Oakland, we're integrating data like building code violations, so like when landlords don't maintain buildings, and some other data sets too. And so we've been having and holding a lot of meetings and workshops with tenants and actually mostly tenant organizers to figure out how to build the tool in a way that would best empower tenant organizing and tenants being able to do some of this research themselves. And of course, we don't want to pretend that some sort of tool is going to solve the problem or replace the important, person-to-person relationships that get built through organizing. But we did realize that we were being kind of flooded with questions all the time, and it was really hard to figure out who owns what and who's evicting whom. And that, so we sort of built this tool so that we could be more effective, and other tenant organizers too could be more effective in forming direct action campaigns. So anyway, that's an ongoing project that I'm very involved in. So. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly lots of challenges. I would say maybe the two biggest are one, just sort of sustainability of project infrastructure. I think as we continue to grow, because we do embrace a sort of volunteer-based model, that's how we started as a collective, it has become increasingly sort of challenging to kind of sometimes keep things going. And I think also the more complicated we get in terms of the tools that we make, like this lookup tool is by far the most complex project. It's expensive to host the data, and it's not the same in terms of what we used to do labor wise or knowledge wise. And so we have been doing more grant writing and trying to get funding to pay for hosting and data and infrastructure, and even sometimes to be able to offer stipends to folks who are putting in tons of hours to the project. But that's hard because we don't have we're not a nonprofit, we're not for profit, we're also not a nonprofit. We don't have paid admin or staff. I put in a lot of time, but all that I can, and I have the luxury of having an academic job. So, but a lot of people don't. And so, I think that's just, it's hard, and it can be, I think sometimes a little bit draining maybe to kind of keep that sort of back end of the project going and sustainable. And then I think sort of related to that, the more complicated, again, we get in terms of tools that we make. So we have the lookup tool has a very, very complicated data pipeline. And I mean, it's a piece of software essentially. We also have people who are working on the front end and design, and we're very critical of the software industry and the sort of technoculture inherent in that. So as people get involved and want to volunteer in our project, it can be, sometimes people might come expecting us to sort of function or run like big tech, which is full of hierarchies and full of very racial and gendered understandings of projects and project management. And so we've had to sometimes do a lot of political education with folks who might want to get involved in working on some of the tools. And yet we also want to be in a place that kind of welcomes support from anybody who is committed to the politics that we share. But that can be challenging too. And so I think we're always sort of grappling with just ethical questions in terms of, we don't want to use Amazon. We hate Amazon. Amazon's a gentrifying force and is working with the police and does all sorts of horrible things. But what happens if the people working on a particular project only know how to use AWS in terms of a kind of a back end? And do we have the capacity to find something more ethical? And do we have the capacity to learn something else? So I think yeah, there are challenges like that as we try to break free of corporate tech reliance, but also sometimes come up to terms with how hard it is to actually do that, and sometimes how impossible it feels to do that. I mean, it's interesting to also historically think about the anti-communism, the Cold War, that was its like main ideology, right? And so, of course, there was the Soviet Union, but multiple times it was said that the top threat to U.S. security was the Black Panthers or the Weather Underground, or these groups that were very much tied to San Francisco and Oakland in terms of their organizing. So this was all happening too, and I think it became this really stark tension. So you have the kind of white Cold War scientist who's going to win the Cold War and contain communism with his technology, and then you have like Angela Davis, who are considered the top security threat, but organizing not that far away. And so you can really see how the Bay Area became this place of immense also suppression and military technologies being tested in Oakland and San Francisco to sort of quell anti-imperial and racial justice organizing. And so, yeah, there's a lot there, and obviously scholars have really done so much work and studied this, but I do think that's significant today because there's still those traditions, those organizing traditions are also still there. And that's partly why also we have such a strong tenant movement in San Francisco. Fights for rent control and against evictions are, most cities that have rent control in California got them during the late 70s and early 80s as a result of tenant organizing that have a really strong racial justice focus. There was this big fight known as the I Hotel in San Francisco, led by Filipinx residents against a big eviction. You have Alcatraz led by the American Indian movement. So there's like so much happening that I think has really sowed the seeds for anti-imperial organizing and racial justice organizing, because it's important to not just dwell on the negative and also remember the sort of power that is historic. So there's a rich history of it's in counter cartography or counter mapping, for instance, of expropriating government or corporate schools for emancipatory means, and we can see this too in other projects of maybe some of that even aligns in projects of land reclamation that we're seeing led by Native communities. There was this also, though, the fights against real estate speculators and getting community land trusts to go in and buy properties. Or in Oakland, there was the Moms for Housing movement that was really powerful a couple of years ago, led by Black unhoused mothers who reclaimed a corporately owned property to make as a refuge for other Black unhoused mothers. And so there's this sort of idea of reclamation that's happening, and I think we can find lessons from a lot of what happens on the ground and how we navigate tools and the digital tools. So it's at this point, Amazon and Google and these companies have huge monopolies on data and storage and infrastructure. And, sometimes we can create alternatives, but sometimes we can also try to expropriate some of what they have monopolized. And so I think some of the best lessons are in terms of the digital are lessons that are already happening beyond the digital. And so I think we're always trying to think through those lessons really. Yeah, so we're continuing to plug away in building some of the tools that I mentioned. There is another project that I've been involved with, that the mapping project is sort of a partner to, and I kind of wear both my mapping project and UT hats when I work on it, but it's called Landlord Tech Watch, and that's been taking up a lot of my time lately. And it's a project where we're actually looking at the surveillance technologies that landlords and property managers use to collect data about tenants and to sometimes blacklist tenants from being able to obtain housing or to evict tenants. So that's something that I've been really focusing on lately because it's a growing industry. And it's, again, always, just as tenants don't know so much about, or it's hard for tenants to know who their landlord is, it's often even harder for them to know what technologies their landlord might be using. So that's something, but other people in the mapping project are working on lots of other projects as well. And so there are lots of media and oral history and zine making projects that are continuing. And we have a new mural that we're thinking through now in San Francisco. In New York, we're working with some groups in Bushwick to produce zines and oral histories about gentrification there. And yeah, lots of things.
On the track beat.
The Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is a living, breathing team that continues their work to this day. Since their founding in 2013, as their team has grown, so too has their visibility and impact. They actively search for people interested in joining their movement, sharing their stories, data, landlord tech, and more. To learn more about the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and Aaron's work, visit antievictionmapping.com.